What I want to look at today, though, are Baptists, the founding of the American Republic. We're going to take Baptists through the War for Independence and the struggle over the Constitution today. Roman numeral 1 is Rhode Island. This is a little-known fact. 2 months before the Declaration of Independence, Rhode Island passed its own Declaration of Independence and declared itself independent from England. Those Baptist folks there were as contrary as ever. And so they just considered themselves their own separate country. One of my favorite stories during the period of time that there's such protest, those of you who've been in U.S. history, I hope remember this, and others of you will have it in the future, next year perhaps, but there's a 20-year period of colonial resistance to the British and what goes on. One of my favorite stories from that period of time, the British have passed laws that you can't buy from anybody in England. And when they did, smuggling became the #1 industry in the colonies. No kidding. I mean, smuggling became the key to the whole economy. John Hancock, who was a Baptist deacon, became a millionaire as a smuggler. But there was a British ship whose job on the coast to intercept smugglers got stuck on a sandbar off the coast in sight of a Baptist church. And they were having a Sunday evening service. And the captain of the ship, since they weren't going to be able to get off the sandbar in the morning, the captain of the ship let all the sailors but 2 go into the town on leave. So here it was, there's this British smuggling ship right there on the sandbar inside of a Baptist church in the middle of their Sunday evening service. And folks just couldn't take it. Pastor suspended the service, men got their boats, went out to the ship, took the 2 guys off of it, set it on fire and burned it. Went back to services when it was done. I mean, there wasn't any question how the Baptists felt about tyranny and what they were dealing with the English government. Well, Roman numeral 2, recognition of Congress. This becomes a more serious issue than you might imagine. You try and put yourself back in that time. The Bible teaches that we're to have the proper response to civil government. What do you do when there's 2 different groups that claim to be your civil government? For example, if you lived in Sri Lanka today, there's 2 different groups that claim to be legitimate government. And if the Bible teaches you to respond to legitimate government, how do you know who to respond to? And you came to a moment when the Continental Congress says the English Parliament's no longer government. But the Parliament and the King say they're still the government. And so folks are left with a decision. And I don't have time to go into it all now. I believe the Bible teaches a certain role for government, and I believe the answer when there's 2 conflicting governments, that a part of the answer you have to look and say which is the closest to the Bible model of government. But there came this moment of tension in the colonies. Now you have this claiming to be the government and this claiming to be the government. Who are we going to respect as a government? And there was a real moment of tension because you've got the Continental Congress, and you've got them trying to put together an army, and you've got all these various things happening. And one of the things that George Washington and all these folks are going to have to ask themselves, are the people going to recognize us as a government? And by the way, it was never unanimous. There was never probably a time when more than 2/3 of the colonists recognized them as a government. But the first group to ever come out in public and say the Continental Congress is the legitimate government is the Philadelphia Baptist Association. And then that sparked a response by several associations of churches, not all Baptist, other groups as well, but other associations of Baptists begin to come out and say, this is the government that the Bible obligates us to be submissive to. The Warren Baptist Association that we mentioned earlier was one of the earliest groups as well. And so it was the Baptists stepping forth first and saying, this is the government, that helped influence other folks to do that. You remember, this is a significant period of time. This is a period of time which Benjamin Franklin is saying to the other members of Congress, we must all hang together, or we most assuredly shall all hang separately. And I mean, that was not a figure of speech. Roman numeral 3. Baptists in England during the War for Independence. Baptists in England during the War for Independence. And this might come as a shock to you, but even the Baptists in England supported the American War for Independence. Why would Baptists in England support the American War for Independence? Travis? Religious liberty. What else? That is a part of it, but there's something else. The whole concept of freedom. But the Bible teaches a role for government. That doesn't have anything to do with what country you live in. And they could see that the government of England, in taking away the liberties of the colonists, would then be tempted to do what? Take away the liberties of folks back in the mother country. Eh? And they were taking a stand for liberty. Liberty is not a national issue. Just to give you an idea how overwhelming support for the War for Independence was in England, this is a letter from a Baptist pastor in London to a Baptist pastor in Rhode Island during the war. He says, I believe all of our Baptist ministers in town, except two, and most of our brethren in the country were on the side of the Americans in the late dispute. We wept when the thirsty plains drank the blood of our departed heroes, and the shout of the King was among us when your well-fought battles were crowned with victory. And to this hour we believe that the independence of America will for a while secure the liberty of this country, but if that continent had been reduced, Britain would not have been long free. Here's a statement from another Baptist pastor named John Ryland in England during the war. If I were Washington, I would summon all the American officers. They should form a circle around me, and I would address them, and we would offer a libation in our own blood. I would order one of them to bring a lancet and a punch bowl, and we would bare our arms and be bled. And when the bowl was full, when we would all be bled, I would call on every man to consecrate himself to the work by dipping his sword into the bowl and entering into a solemn covenant engagement by oath one to another. And we would swear by him that sits upon the throne and liveth forever and ever that we would never sheath our swords while there was an English soldier in arms remaining in America. By the way, if you think Baptist preachers just started getting in trouble by preaching on political issues, I promise you the host went before us. Roman numeral 4. Richard Furman. Richard Furman was a Baptist pastor in South Carolina. Today there's a Furman University that's a well-known Southern Baptist school. It was named after him. During a lengthy period of time in the War for Independence in South Carolina, the British control South Carolina. I mean, they do. There's so much opposition to them. Francis Marion, the Swamp Foxes, leading guerrilla raids out of the swamps, and Andrew Sumter's doing that, and other folks. But Richard Furman has been chased, had to flee Charleston to keep from being arrested by the British, because he's preaching the just cause of the War for Independence. And Furman begins to travel around among the American guerrilla bands and the military camps and so forth, preaching to the troops the justness of their cause. And when Lord Cornwallis, the British general, at one point he starts putting out bounties. So much money if you would kill or capture the Swamp Fox. So much money if you'd kill or capture Sumter. So much money if you would kill or capture Pickens. He put the largest bounty that he put on Richard Furman, because he made the statement that he feared the prayers of Richard Furman more than the armies of Sumter and Marion put together. A number of years later, James Monroe, who's the 5th president, and you'll sometimes hear James Monroe quoted as one of those people that didn't believe religion should be injected in public life. Fact is, when James Monroe was president, he had Richard Furman come and preach to the Congress and introduced him as a man who did the British harm more damage than the military ever did with his preaching, and had him preach to Congress. Can you imagine inviting somebody in to preach to Congress today? And it's not that there isn't a need, I just can't imagine Congress putting up with it. Roman numeral 5, John Gano. John Gano. He was a Baptist pastor in New York, and in the beginning of the war, he went as a chaplain with the Army and stayed with the Army during the entire war. By the way, that angered the British so much that when they took New York City, they took his church, the church building that he was pastor of, and they used it as a stable for the horses. By the way, the British routinely looted and burnt Baptist churches when they took over an area, because they operated on the assumption the Baptists were on the other side. Gano, again, stays the whole time. He eventually becomes chaplain to Washington and the officer corps. He's actually in that role for several years. George Washington, don't believe all the nonsense you hear about him being a deist and all that. That's absolutely not true. George Washington was a saved man. He was belonged to the Episcopal Church, which means he did not, believe necessarily all Baptist distinctives, but he was a saved man. He loved the Lord. He kept a journal of his daily devotions. And there's just a lot of stuff being said today to make him look bad that is not factual. He was a godly man. But when Gano became his chaplain, one of the things that Washington would do after all the care you can imagine of maintaining a revolutionary army was at night he liked to sit and discuss with chaplains and officers and debate theology. And he and Gano got into a discussion over baptism by immersion that lasted for years, going back and forth about believers' baptism or infant baptism. And later, when the war was over and the church had been reclaimed in New York, George Washington came to Gano and told him he had become convinced of believers' baptism and asked Gano to baptize him at the First Baptist Church in New York City. And so Gano baptized him there in front of a number of witnesses, and then there was a number of record of that. He said, and this is a quote at occasion, he said, "I have been investigating the Scripture, and I believe immersion to be the baptism taught in the Word of God, and I ask it at your hands. I do not wish any parade made or the army called out, but simply a quiet demonstration of the ordinance." Never left the Episcopal Church and joined the church there, anything of that nature, but he just became convinced that believers' baptism was Bible baptism. And so he asked Gano to baptize him based on his profession of faith, and Gano did. Form number 6, John Hart, H-A-R-T. John Hart. He was from New Jersey, was a Baptist layman. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. If you recall the Declaration of Independence, you have this being said at the end of it, that we pledge our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor to this cause. That was not just a fancy phrase. I mean, they were pledging their lives. What happens to you if you lead a revolution or a war for independence, if you will, and you fail? Well, yeah, so what people pat you on the back and say, "Oh, well, it was a good try." And that's not what happens. What happens if you get caught? You die. What happens if you get caught in the course of the fighting? What happens if in this case it's the British, take control of the area that your property is in during the course of the fighting? Do you think they assign guards to see to it that your house is well maintained and undisturbed and all your property well taken care of? When the British took New Jersey, they destroyed his home, they tore up his farm, they took all his property. He fled, lived in the woods. At the end of the war, he owned absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. When he said he was pledging his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor, he kept his life and his sacred honor, but he lost his fortune. Tell you what, sometimes it costs something to stand up for what's right. I will tell you, I think it was Pastor that said this Sunday, somebody said it Sunday, you Pastor or Dr. Buffington, we have become so materially minded, I have a hard time picturing many of our folks making sacrifice like that today. And I have a hard time imagining it. Roman numeral 7. George Washington's statement about the Baptists. This is a quote. I want you to take the time to write it down. It's a statement of George Washington's after the war. Baptists throughout America, uniformly and almost unanimously, were the firm friends to civil liberty and the persevering promoters of our glorious revolution. I like that title. The persevering promoters of our glorious revolution. Roman numeral 8. Baptists in the Constitution. After the war is over, then you have the really tough question. What kind of a government are we going to have? The nation was operating under an Articles of Confederation, but that proved not to be strong enough to maintain a nation. So there becomes this extensive debate over what the government should be like. And the whole course of the debates for history class and all that. But the Constitutional Convention finally comes up with the Constitution that we have now and presents it as the basis for government, but it's got to be ratified by 9 of 13 states to go into effect. And it quickly passes a few states, but then the debate really becomes heated over it. And this is a large part of the argument. There's nothing in that Constitution about religious freedom and some other freedoms. And many people wanted a Bill of Rights listed so that there couldn't be any question. And good men argued this. Some people said, no, don't start listing rights because then the government will think that's the only rights you've got. Other people said, no, we'd better have them listed so it's clear to everybody we have these rights. And if you read the debate, I have over 2,000 pages on the debate. These were good men arguing about the best way to preserve freedom. This was not bad guys against good guys. These were good men arguing over the best means. And largely the Baptists were opposed to the ratification of the Constitution. Well, it came down to a place where Virginia wield such influence, it looks like whether or not Virginia ratifies the Constitution is going to determine whether it makes it or not. George Washington is speaking out for the Constitution. James Madison is speaking out for the Constitution. Patrick Henry is speaking out against it. The debate in Virginia becomes fierce. And the Baptists in Virginia are opposing the Constitution. And for a while it looked like they're going to be back to square one. But James Madison went to the Baptists, and he felt they had become the swing vote. Virginia's the swing state, and the Baptists are the swing vote in Virginia. What the Baptists do is going to determine what happens. He went to the Baptists, and he promised them that if the Constitution was ratified, he would immediately set out to campaign for a list of amendments to the Constitution that would list a Bill of Rights like the Baptists were demanding. He made the case that if we end up with nothing, we're going to be in anarchy, and this is going to be a disaster. But said, if you will swing and support the Constitution, I promise you we'll get your Bill of Rights. And he persuades enough of the Baptist preachers of that they come out, change their position, encourage the ratification of the Constitution. It swings the vote of Virginia, and that ends up carrying enough states that the Constitution is ratified. Ironically enough, for several years, it quickly then goes to 12 states. Rhode Island didn't ratify it. And there's all these statements about the independent, contrary, Baptists in Rhode Island won't work with anybody, won't get along with anybody. And they still go a number of years without ratifying the Constitution, clear up to the point that the Congress says, okay, if you don't ratify the Constitution, from now on you're a separate country, and we will feel no obligation to defend you if Britain invades. Even then, it only passed their state legislature by 2 votes. And they almost became an independent country. You know, those Baptists, hard for them to get along with anybody. This is the amazing thing about this story. I will tell you, I've become such a cynic over the years. When politicians start making promises to me, my assumption is the opposite is going to happen. You know, I'm going to sort of go along with old Will Rogers' line that you've probably heard. He said, how can you tell when a politician's lying to you? Lips are moving, yeah. But here's the story of a politician that keeps his promise. After the Constitution is ratified, James Madison gets elected to the first Congress after the Constitution is ratified, and he immediately makes as his priority getting a Bill of Rights, of which the First Amendment would be a guarantee of religious freedom. He keeps his promise, gets the Bill of Rights through the Congress, gets the bill of these amendments drafted by the states, and very shortly we have a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution the way that he promised. And he would later credit the Baptists for making the whole difference in terms of what happened in Virginia, and most people credit what happened in Virginia for making the difference in the ratification of the Constitution. Roman numeral 9. However, The Constitution, even with the Bill of Rights, only limits the federal government. It doesn't tell you what a state can do. 9 states still have state churches, including Virginia. And so Baptists still have the same problem they were having under the British government in a lot of places, because how well do Baptists get along with a state church? Well, believing in separation of church and state, there's just this barrier we can't get over. And there was an attempt, and this is Roman numeral 9 here, Baptists reject compromise in Virginia. Baptists reject compromise in Virginia. Begin to see how powerful the Baptists were, and they're demanding that you do away with the state church and all that kind of thing. So they offered a compromise. Because before this, everyone's supposed to pay a tax to the Episcopal Church. They said, okay, we'll let you designate your tax money. You can pay it to the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, or the Baptist Church. Those were far and away the 4 most prominent churches. And that meant that you could then designate on your taxes that your tax would go to your church. The Methodists agreed to this compromise, and the Presbyterians agreed to this compromise, but the Baptists rejected it. Why did the Baptists reject it? It was still a state church. There's no business tax money going to churches. It was still we have 4 state churches instead of 1. Is that separation of church and state? No. By the way, I wonder how many of our folks today, were they offered a deal like that, would take it to get the money. The Baptists still fought the establishment of any kind of a state church. As a matter of fact, they fought this so hard that it discredited the Episcopal Church in Virginia, and people left the Episcopal Church in droves, and the Episcopal Church collapsed in Virginia. And this was somewhat embarrassing when you have a state church that no one will go to. And it just sort of, eventually it's de-established, legally, but it sort of collapses by default as people abandon the Episcopal Church. During this battle, people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison came out on the side of the Baptists. And the Baptists supported them, and that's going to lead me to the next one. Roman numeral 10 is the Baptists and Thomas Jefferson. This is going to seem like a strange alliance. Thomas Jefferson didn't believe you read a lot about our founders not being saved men. Most of that's not true. In Thomas Jefferson's case, it is. In fact, most of what you hear about the others is really something taken from the life of Thomas Jefferson. He's not a saved man, didn't believe in the inspiration of the Bible, didn't believe in the deity of Christ. He was attacked during his political campaigns as being an atheist. He wasn't an atheist, but you know how political campaigns go. He was attacked as not being a Bible believer, which he really wasn't a Bible believer, and yet his most prominent supporters were the Baptists. This would seem like, a surprise. But this is what happens. Thomas Jefferson is absolutely committed to the idea of complete religious liberty. And the Baptists decided they'd rather have an unsaved man that believed in religious liberty than a saved man that believed in a state church. And it is Thomas Jefferson's testimony that he got his philosophy of government that he talked about so much that helped influence other people from the Baptists. By the way, there's something to be said about this. They spent time talking to one who wasn't one of their own about government. But Thomas Jefferson's own testimony was that he went every month to the business meeting at the local Baptist church. And that is not where you normally draw your most visitors, okay? Especially your most lost folks. But he testified he went to the business meeting every month to watch how they did business. And there is an old book called Belcher's Religious Denominations that says this, quote, Jefferson said that he considered Baptist church government the only form of pure democracy which then existed in the world, and had concluded that it would be the best plan of government for the American colonies. This was 10 years before the American Revolution. Here's what he came away with talking about. So here you were. You had a written basis for church government. Some people tell the story and they say the church constitution. That's not what he was talking about. You had a written basis for church government. It was the Bible. It was the authority. The people had a right to vote, but the church was not lost in everybody trying to administrate it day by day. You had one administrator of voting people and a written form of government. So he helped popularize those ideas. What do we end up with? A voting people. Okay, we can't get everybody together in Washington, D.C. to vote every time, so what happens? We elect representatives who in theory vote for us. We have a voting people, one-man administration, no matter how many folks he's got working for him. Do you know the American concept of the president was copied after the model of a Baptist pastor? Now, you read most forms of government before this time. You hear about kings, you hear about prime ministers, you hear about premiers. You don't hear anybody called a president. Thomas Jefferson got that idea from watching the pastor of the Baptist church. By the way, can you imagine how it might have affected our history if that church had been like some Baptist churches, all they ever did at business meetings was fight? They taught a lost man the Bible principle of government by practicing the Bible principle of church government. And they became his supporters even when others were calling him atheist and so forth. And one of the most famous documents in American history was written by Thomas Jefferson to a Baptist association. It's misused because it is the document in which Jefferson invents the phrase separation of church and state. People talk about that like it's in a constitution. It's not. Let me tell you what he was really saying. This is a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association. They have written him a letter complimenting his stand on religious liberty, and he's writing them back. The affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation which you are so good as to express towards me on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association give me the highest satisfaction. My duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interests of my constituents. In proportion as they are persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with solemn reverence the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation on behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural duties, and convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my high respect and esteem. All he said, in echoing the First Amendment, is that you should never unite the organization of church and state, which is Bible truth. He never said that a government cannot recognize the Creator. In his very letter, which he's writing as president, he honors the Creator in this very letter. As president of the country when Washington, D.C. was established and under the control of the federal government, he as the president was over the schools in Washington, D.C. You know what he required in the schools in Washington, D.C.? Prayer and Bible study. He didn't see that any contradiction with the First Amendment or separation of church and state. In his whole philosophy, if you'd said you have to teach Baptist doctrine in the public schools, or you have to teach congregational doctrine, or Church of England doctrine, that would have been a violation of his principles. But not teaching that the world was created by the Creator, no matter whether you teach that or not, it's just plain obvious. Okay? So his attitude on separation of church and state has been twisted an awful lot of different ways. Roman numeral 11. We want to go back to Isaac Backus. We talked about Isaac Backus and the Warren Association, his 60-year battle for religious freedom. This battle came to center in the state of Massachusetts. You know, the state felt like they were compromising. They offered to license all the Baptists because there became more and more Baptists in the state. They offered them a compromise. We'll license you, and then we'll leave you alone. Okay? A lot of some other religious groups, I shouldn't say a lot because they didn't offer it to a lot, but some other religious groups took that deal. What do you think the Baptists, especially with the influence of Isaac Backus, who's pastoring in that state, how do you think the Baptists responded to that deal? Absolutely not. You can't license what's God's. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. If I'm driving on Caesar's road, you can license my driving on Caesar's road. But the church is not Caesar's. I'm going to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, but I'm going to have to render unto God that which is God's. And they refused the offer of licensure. And they fought legal battle after legal battle after legal battle. And they did not win in Bacchus's lifetime. But he became the center of the leadership in the fight there. And in 1833, after his death, but because of his 60-year battle, complete religious liberty was granted in Massachusetts. 1833. And they're no longer licensed or anybody or taxed anybody for the support of the church. Let me tell you, that'll cover our notes for this. Let me tell you a little bit more about Daniel Boone as we finish. He's a hero and a subject of study of mine. Went to start the settlement in Boonesboro when he was 40. His brother was a Baptist pastor, started a Baptist church, and just everybody went to church there. It was a Baptist settlement. Years later, Daniel Boone decided Kentucky was getting too crowded. As he explained it, you could sometimes look over the horizon and see smoke from another cabin. And he moved to Missouri. And when he moved to Missouri, the Spanish owned it. And he became a sheriff for the Spanish. And his exploits in Missouri were as great as his exploits in Kentucky. Matter of fact, he fought in his last Indian battle when he was 84. He continued traveling over the countryside, hunting and exploring and trapping until he was 86. And I mean, it's like he lived a full lifetime and then went to Missouri and lived another one. And while he was in Missouri, one of his son-in-laws was a Baptist preacher, and he usually, when he was in that area, would go to church at his son-in-law's church. But folks became real anxious to get Daniel Boone in their church. I mean, he was so well-known and so highly regarded, everybody was trying to, Church of Christ was trying to get him in the church, Disciples of Christ in that day, but they were trying to get him in a church, in a Baptist, and a Presbyterians, and all that. And so this got to be a problem for him. So anybody that knew anything about Daniel Boone knew that he was a smoothly accomplished liar, not for the purpose of conning people, but just get people off his back. He did that with the Indians a great deal. And so he decided he'd come up with this way to get people off his back about what church to join. And so he just knew the debate over baptism inside and out. And if the Baptist came to him and tried to get him to join the Baptist church, he'd start telling them all about infant baptism and how convinced he was that was scriptural. And he said, well, I like your church, or I like your preaching and all that. But I said, I just believe in infant baptism. I can't join. And when the Baptists came to him, or when the Presbyterians came to him, he'd lay out the whole Bible doctrine of believer's baptism. Say, I really like your church, and I really like your preacher. But say, I can't join a Presbyterian church because I believe in believer's baptism. When the disciples of Christ would come with their attitude that you got saved through baptism, he'd tell them he really liked their church and really liked their preaching and all that, but he didn't believe that, but he couldn't join Disciples of Christ. And the Episcopal Church, he'd explain to them, he couldn't join the Episcopal Church because he didn't believe you could baptize babies and all that kind of thing. And he just played this whole debate over baptism as a way of getting out of whoever he was dealing with and whoever he was talking to. Towards the end of his life, this really bothered his son-in-law that was a Baptist preacher, because he'd heard various quotes, about his position on baptism and so forth. So he went to talk to his father-in-law, and those of you who don't already know, talking to your in-laws about these things probably turns out to be harder than talking to anybody, but I suppose when your in-law is nationally famous, that probably doesn't make it any easier. But his son-in-law, Flanders Calloway, who was a Baptist preacher, went to talk to him about this. What do you really believe about baptism? And Daniel Boone let him know let him know he'd just been talking his way out of all that difficulty, as he was sort of famous for doing, talking his way out of all that difficulty. He actually got the Shawnees to adopt him one time instead of killing him. You know about that. But, and when the Indians first came to the siege of Boonesboro, he raised the British flag. When the Indians and the British troops came, he flew up a British flag and said, we've been with you all along. And when they wanted to come in, he said, no, we've got smallpox. Everybody's sick and we don't want you to get it. And But he told his sons that it was ought to be plain as day to any man that look at the issue. What the Bible taught was believer's baptism. All the rest of that was just smoke he was sending out to keep from getting trapped in folks' churches. Y'all are dismissed.